Hey everybody, welcome to week 5. We're making good progress. Just a little overview of this week's lecture and the next section of this course. We're covering the executive branch today. Next week we'll be covering the legislative branch, and the week following we'll be covering the judicial branch. This section of the course focuses on understanding basically how the three branches operate and their primary purposes, and a brief overview of some historical examples of these powers being used. So we're going to be covering these three concepts, these three bodies, and then we're going to be taking a quiz at the end of week 8 on this content. At week 8, we will also have our midterm paper due, which will be a one-page essay. Next week, I'll provide an overview video in addition to our lecture on how I suggest you complete that assignment. All right, let's get going. All right, so right here I put an overview of a lot of our learning objectives for today's lecture. Definitely have way too many up here, and apologies for the date. I copy and paste some of the content from last year's lectures, and then I edit, and I forgot to change that date because, well, it's the learning objective slide. So make sure you go over this. This is just a highlights what we're going to be talking about, and let's get going. Let's start by providing a very simple overview of the executive branch. For one, it was originally designed to be a check on unreasonable legislative bodies. Before we had the federalism under the Constitution, we had the Articles of Confederation, which had a excessively powerful legislative body governing on the federal level, although we did have an extremely weak federal government. But when we created our Constitution, we drafted our Constitution and created our system of federal government, we created the branch. And in the executive branch, we see some of the primary actors being the president, the vice president, their cabinet, which is a collective of specifically appointed individuals, the bureaucracy, merit-based hires, millions of individuals, and governors. It's important to understand that we also have executive branches on the state and federal level. So we will talk about governors very briefly to make sure we understand that general concept. So let's keep going. All right, if you wanted to become the president, you do have to meet some requirements. First off, you have to be a natural born citizen. You can be born abroad, but you have to be born to American parents. A good example of this is Ted Cruz, who ran for president in 2016, was born in Canada, but is a natural born citizen. We also see that you have to be 35 years or older. You have to be a resident of the United States for the past 14 years. And if you meet all of these three requirements, you have the potential to becoming the president of the United States, if you can get a good campaign out there. We also see that if you do become the president, you make $400,000 a year, most of which you will not be spending, because you also get $169,000 for expenses and many additional services during your time as president. So, electing the president, what is this process like? Well, parties nominate candidates every 4 years. We see the DNC, the RNC, the Democratic National Convention, the Republican National Convention. We do understand that the parties are responsible and have the opportunity to provide a single candidate. We see this can be done traditionally through primary votes, but we've also seen in the most recent election this can be done quite rapidly through, party voting and general lines of secession, as we saw with the Democratic presidential candidate after Joe Biden stepped down and Kamala Harris stepped in the middle of a presidential election. We also see citizens technically do not vote for president directly. We vote for electors to cast their ballots within the Democratic and Republican National Conventions. You see, maybe you've seen this on TV, the RNC, the DNC, these big conventions at the end of the year in which they have delegates from all of the states. And there's a point at this convention where they do the roll call, where they go around for every single state and all the delegates from that state to declare who they are voting for. Oftentimes, once we get to the DNC or the RNC, these decisions have been clearly finalized, and you see this more of a exciting expression of backing a single candidate over a true roll call vote. The roll call votes happen by the general population during primary election processes. We also see citizens cast ballots for presidential electors who then vote for president and vice president in the Electoral College. That is the process I just explained, and that's how it operates on the primary level. We also see that is very similar to how it operates once we get to the final election. We will cover elections and campaigns, week 9 or 10-ish, so we won't go into detail on that today. And if there is a tie when electing the president, remember this from last week, the 12th Amendment establishes, well, not last week, last section of the course. The 12th Amendment establishes that the House of Representatives will vote to break the tie. Important takeaway from this slide. In a moment, we're going to go over every single specific power granted to the head of the executive branch, the president. But it is also important to understand some generalized types of executive powers. And here we're going to make two important distinctions between expressed and inherent powers, and also identify emergency powers. So express powers, these are powers directly written in the Constitution or statutory law. They were expressed by our founding fathers, a simple way to remember that. You can see constitutional powers, powers directly granted in our Constitution. Statutory law, these are powers granted through laws enacted by Congress. So of course, our government we have a breathing and changing and forever changing government. And when we write new laws and draft and pass bills into law, we see we are creating statutory code, statutory powers. And we also see on the contrasting side of that, inherent powers. These are powers defined through practice rather than through law. This is not directly granted in the Constitution. One example of this, our Constitution does say, quote, the president should take care that the laws be faithfully executed, end quote. How will the president do so? Well, he has these inherent powers to make sure that these laws are faithfully executed. So the role and responsibility of the executive branch is constantly changing. It's a breathing position. We also see that emergency powers, these are inherent powers exercised by the president during times of national crisis. So we see that the power and role of the president can expand during times of national crisis or national security threats. We also see when we talk about these powers specifically, we can go over a couple examples of what a president can do while in the office. I have 2 slides. It will be continued on to the next, covering some of these specific powers. First off, one of the most important powers, and one we're seeing expressed right now in Trump's current presidency, appointment powers. This is the power of the president to appoint cabinet, sub-cabinet, federal judgeships, agency heads, and many others, up to 9,000 positions roughly within our federal government. We see these individuals make up the cabinet. We will go over those, some details on that body in a moment, but we see this can be a signal for what the focus of the new administration will be. A changing wave of cabinet appointments can really represent a changing wave in governance. And the individuals that make up a cabinet are the heads of various and numerous specific department agencies, some of which we will go into detail in just a second. We also see the president can grant reprieves, pardons, and commutations. Oftentimes you see presidents enacting pardons and these things at the end of their presidency. We've seen some examples of Andrew Johnson pardoning all Confederate soldiers at the beginning of his presidency, Richard Nixon getting pardoned by Ford at the beginning of Ford's presidency, and Carter's pardon of Vietnam draft resistors. We also see many presidents have left office enacting widespread pardons for nonviolent crime offenders and various things of that nature. We also want to make sure that we understand what reprieves, pardons, and commutations are. So a reprieve is really well, for one, let's start with pardons. Pardons, you are forever excused of a crime you have committed. You are released from jail if you were serving time, and it will be removed and expunged from your record. A reprieve, on the other hand, is a postponement of the execution of a federal sentence. Maybe the law that we are charging you for is in flux. Maybe you were in the 90s charged for distribution of large amounts of cannabis, but since you've been locked up, you have had, and you haven't had your trial yet for some miraculous reason, the laws have changed, and we can grant a reprieve to allow you to have more time for the laws to be solidified before your trial. That's an extremely weird specific example, but I want to give you a physical example so you can visualize this. Pardons, complete release, and you've been forgiven. A commutation is the reduction of time to be served. So the conviction can still be present on your record. You still may have to check that felon box if that's what it was, but you are able to be reduced. The time you serve is able to be reduced. This has happened for a lot of individuals who were charged with distributing of cannabis. They were told that they were granted commutations and released from jail, although this still remained on their record. We've seen even recent example of Donald Trump pardoning individuals that participated in the January 6th event, in which there were individuals that stormed the Capitol in Washington, D.C. during a time of a vote on the solidifying the election results back in 2021. So we see that reprieves, pardons, and commutations can be used very strategically at many times and is a commonly used and frequently used power granted to the president. But it's not just a pardon. We also see reprieves and commutations included. And we have to be able to define what those two additional powers are. Now, we also know that wartime powers exist. The president is the ultimate decision maker in military matters. This can result in troops being sent many places and even at various points in our history, in particular, nuclear bombs being utilized. So we see wartime powers in any time of war and conflict. We can expand the power of the president in regard to his military or her military influence. So we also can see that the president has the power to nationalize the National Guard during times of national distress or social unrest. We've seen this utilized during various times of protest. We've heard a lot of debate about when this can be best utilized. We have seen, if you are interested in American history or the Civil Rights Movement, a very famous picture of a girl, and I forget the exact college. I want to say Ohio State, but I think I'm probably wrong there, so don't quote me and don't think you have to remember this. But a photo of her on her hands and knees with her arms out with her boyfriend in front of her as he was shot during a protest at a college in the 70s by the National Guard. We also see that a power granted to the president consists of diplomatic recognition and the ability to sign treaties. The president has the sole power of recognizing other states. We look at international conflicts like the conflict that's happening in Israel and Palestine, and the power of the president of the United States to recognize either Palestine or Israel, as it had recognized Israel a long time ago in the past, can create significant downstream effects. Another example of this power consists of Afghanistan. As the Taliban did obtain control of the government in Afghanistan in 2020, the United States has still yet to recognize their power and authority in the region, and which has resulted in significant delays in their ability to trade and impediments of their ability to be recognized and play a role on the international stage. Now, we also see that treaties do have to go through the Senate to be ratified, but the president does have the power to sign and negotiate these treaties. We also see the president can make executive agreements. These are agreements made between the president and other state leaders in which we do not need Senate approval. We could make various and wide-ranging agreements with the heads of other executive administrative agencies in their government. So we also see that the president can set the congressional agenda when they give the State of the Union speech. One of our optional readings this week is a video of some of the most noteworthy State of the Union moments throughout our history, as we have had this represent either the political climate, as we heard the many representatives yell out, "You lie," to Barack Obama when he was giving his State of the Union speech. We see that you can oftentimes, when watching from home, see the partisan applause at times, and oftentimes as well the bipartisan support on certain issues. This State of the Union speech is often utilized to refocus our federal government on a specific aim and unify our goals. Of course, this does not come with any legislative actions, and it is an opportunity in the public eye and in the eyes of our representatives to set the tone. And it is a speech given by the president. So we also see that the president has the power to maintain significant veto powers. In a moment, we're going to go over the different kinds of vetoes, as we have a pocket or a regular veto, in which a president has the power to abolish any legislation that has been passed by the House and the Senate with just one signature. If you do not have the president's approval, even if you have had a bill make it through the Senate and the House, you will not have the bill go into law. And one thing we have seen in recent years, in recent weeks, at high use are executive orders. Executive orders are, in a way, pieces of legislation signed and drafted by the president and the executive branch themselves, in which alter or change executive administrative agencies. Although we've seen executive orders be utilized to draft expansive legislation that has been restricted by the courts during numerous presidencies, and we'll go over that in just a moment as well. So for that last slide, it is important to remember the general powers of the president. Now let's talk about presidential veto power. So once the legislative branch drafts and approves a bill through the House and the Senate, it goes to the president for the final approval. So the president can sign it into law with just one signature and then it will go into effect, or they can sign a regular veto. This is where the president decides a law will not go into effect. They will sign that it will not go into effect and often comes with a veto message specifying why it was vetoed. Now, the president does not have to give a clear reason why they vetoed legislation. They have the power to enact what is called a pocket veto. This is where the president refuses to sign or veto a bill, and it eventually dies after a certain amount of time sitting on their desk. And if they were to try and implement this bill again, Congress must reconvene and vote again in the next section. In the next session. Language. We also see executive orders. So this is a fascinating power given to the president. We see it ebbs and flows in the way the executive orders have been interpreted in their ability to alter government on the federal level. So when you define the power of an executive order, it has the power to establish or modify rules and practices of his executive administrative agencies. Now, this is a very vague definition. Now, we also see that executive orders can be aimed to enforce legislative statutes. So think of it this way. Say a law was passed 10 years ago, but we have had a hard time enforcing it because we didn't think about a couple variables. So you can sign an executive order to address those flaws and to address the things that have impeded us from enforcing previously enforced legislation. We also see that this enforces the Constitution or treaties with foreign nations at various times. We see that's an expanding role, and we see some examples of that happening throughout every president. Some examples I wanted to talk about today that help give us an understanding of the checks and balances within our government, as well as the expansive power of executive orders, consists of 3 executive orders by 3 recent presidents. And I'll mention one from Biden again, as I just didn't have it in the slide and didn't have enough space. So first, Bush's order to create the Department of Homeland Security. Congress actually passed a bill solidifying this executive order and established the Homeland Security Act to officially establish the Department of Homeland Security in 2002. But it was originally started by George Bush days after 9/11 occurred, passing a reactionary executive measure in which he created the Department of Homeland Security and declared a head to the agency, announcing a new member of the cabinet and appointing them directly. Now, an executive order can create an agency and it can appoint a head of that agency. But for that agency to begin operating, it needs to be approved and passed through legislation within Congress. We also see, and this is an example of how Congress supported the actions sparked within an executive order by George Bush in 2001. We also see Obama created an executive order on unauthorized immigrants, which greatly expanded the powers and funding to our immigration agencies. And we also see that this was overturned by the U.S. courts, as this was viewed as an excessive use of executive power, as this was not a related executive administrative agency. So we also see that Trump enacted a executive order in his first term as president, in which was referred to on the media as the travel ban. We saw there were 3 versions of this executive order. The first 2 were struck down by the courts, but once we saw that the nations consisted in the list were altered to meet the court standard that it did not exclusively relate to nations with a predominantly Muslim population, we see that the third example of his executive order was allowed, implemented, and enforced. So we also see that if you look at President Biden's past term in office, he tried to enact an executive order early on forgiving student loan debt nationally at a large rate, not entirely, but at a large rate. And this was also struck down by the courts as the power of the purse is exclusively designated to the legislative body. The president should not influence the role of finances in the role of the federal budget through executive orders, and that is why Joe Biden's executive order was struck down. We also see another one of Trump's executive orders in recent months, recent weeks, that is a good example of the power of the courts is when he enacted an executive order to end birthright citizenship, but that was struck down by the courts, citing the 14th Amendment, in which they directly grant birthright citizenship to individuals, a Reconstruction era constitutional amendment, which we will go over week 9, I believe, when we talk about civil rights and civil liberties. So, when we have a president, remember that John Locke quote on tyranny, the responsibility, I cannot directly quote it off the top of my head, but the responsibility of the masses uh, if a leader is too exorbitant in their power and self-interested, it is loosely speaking the responsibility of the individuals to stand up to this exorbitant use of power. Well, when we were debating our federal government, we implemented a structure of impeachment to protect us from individuals with exorbitant amounts of power. So the impeachment process comes in 2 steps. If you Google this question, when I ask you this on the quizzes, I will know you're using Google because you'll say there's 4 steps because Google breaks it down in excessive details. We are understanding this as 2 official steps in 2 different bodies. You have to have the impeachment, in which the House of Representatives votes to impeach the president. There are multiple steps in this process, but we are looking at it as one overall step, the impeachment process within the House. The second step in the impeachment process is removal from office. You can be impeached by the House of Representatives and still be president for the rest of your term. You could even run for president again. But if you have been removed from office, which is a vote that occurs in the Senate, you cannot finish your term as president. You must immediately vacate the office. So, overview. There is a 2-step process for impeachment. The first step is impeachment in the House of Representatives. The second step is removal from office in the Senate. Remember, bicameralism, the division of power within the legislative body into 2 branches. We're giving 2 steps, 1 to each branch. The large, I wouldn't say emotion-filled, but the body with 435 representatives with smaller districts that have the ability to represent more niche perspectives has the power to vote for the first time in the impeachment process. We have seen this has occurred multiple times, although when we have seen these votes make it to the Senate, we have not seen a single president ever be removed from office. The pressures often either encourage them to resign from the post, or we see that they just simply finish out their term in office and do not run again, or this issue is not relevant by the time they run again. So when you vote in the House of Representatives, you simply need a majority of representatives to vote for impeachment. And 435, split that in half, add 1, that's how many votes you need to impeach a president. Now the second step, removal from office. You need 2/3 majority because we want to make sure that this is definitely the right move before we remove a sitting president. That is why the calmer body of just 100 representatives that represent more umbrella positions within their states have to make this vote. And they have never voted to remove an office in our United States, remove a president from office in U.S. history. Now let's look at the history of some impeachments. So we have had 4 successful impeachments in U.S. history among 3 different presidents. And none of these presidents were ever removed from the office by the U.S. Senate. So these impeachments happened in 1868, 1998, 2019, and 2021. And remember, 3 different presidents have been impeached. Andrew Johnson was the one impeached in 1868 due to numerous conflicts and just hitting a boiling point of tension within our federal government, specifically focused on Andrew Johnson and his pushback to Reconstruction era expansions of civil rights and civil liberties to newly freed African Americans in the South. We also see Bill Clinton's impeachment due to a social conflict that occurred that also resulted in him lying while under oath while residing as president. He was, of course, not removed from office, but he was voted to be impeached and did not and walked away from federal politics after his presidency was over. We also see Donald Trump had experienced 2 impeachments that did vote successfully in the House of Representatives, although he was acquitted by both in the Senate in 2019 due to some international conflicts regarding his role in communications with another foreign leader. And we also see in 2021 due to his role in influencing what was known as the events that occurred on January 6th. We also see that one president has resigned prior to an impeachment process that was undeniably underway. We saw Richard Nixon, due to the Watergate scandal, had an impeachment process being brought forward. This is one of the only impeachment processes that would have very likely resulted in him being removed from office by the Senate. Richard Nixon resigned from the office before there was a vote on impeachment, showing the pressures of the impeachment process without having to cast a single vote. Once again, technical difficulties, so if the flow was messed up, I apologize. But let's talk about the cabinet. All right, so the cabinet acts as an advisory group for the president. You see there are roughly 26 specific positions, although we do see at various points in history these positions do not have to be filled, and we can even see the expansion of the cabinet to include another additional member or less. There's even been a point in early American history when we saw a horse act as the head of a department in the cabinet for a president early on. We're not going to talk about that. But these are individuals that are directly appointed by the president. Remember, there are up to 900 of these posts, but most of these posts that are reliant on the president's appointment consist of federal judges and Supreme Court justices, while the cabinet does not include any of those judges or Supreme Court justices. The cabinet exclusively includes advisors for the president. We see they tend to make up heads of executive departments and also various other significant roles that work directly with the president. Some individuals in the cabinet consist of the vice president, the White House chief of staff, some of the heads of various executive departments consisting of the secretaries of agriculture, commerce, defense, education, energy, housing and human services, Homeland Security. Remember, George Bush created that through an executive order in 2001. Housing and Urban Development, Interior, Labor, State, Transportation, Treasury, Veteran Affairs, Transportation, many departments within our federal government. Now, of course, numerous have been left vacant during certain presidencies, but we see that the presidents often bring a quick wave of new appointments. As we've seen, we're at the time of an early presidency for Donald Trump's second term, and with this, he brought a wide range of new appointments, some that have caught some national attention, consisting of JFK or Pete Hegseth, some noteworthy individuals, and we see that this unorthodox approach to the executive branch is represented by the cabinet individuals appointed by the president. And you can see the approach they are going to take in the next 4 years when you simply see the cabinet appointments they make. Now, I am going to go through 2 specific departments within our executive branch, just to give an explanation of how they operate and how they're connected to the executive branch and how they were created. Remember, the takeaways you need to have from these slides are in the What Do We Learn slides at the end. So make sure you're getting what you need out of this, as I will also be providing a little extra background information. So the Department of Homeland Security was created through an executive order in 2001 and officially established in Congress in 2002, which shows that this is an opportunity in which Congress could have checked the president, but instead reinforced the decisions made. This was created in response to the attacks in New York on 9/11 and Pennsylvania and DC. We also see this was created through the combination of all or part of 22 different federal departments and agencies into a unified agency. So oftentimes when we create new departments within the federal government, within the executive branch, we see various agencies and administrations being merged, combined, or moved around instead of necessarily exclusively just being created. So we saw this really just focusing in on a lot of the agencies we had working in different departments of our government. One example would be, you know, airport security, TSA, that was included in a part of this refocusing of an executive body of the Department of Homeland Security. And we saw this was nationalized, and we'll talk about that again when we talk about nationalization later on. So we will also want to talk about some of the functions of the Department of Homeland Security. Their roles and responsibilities consist of preventing and responding to terrorist attacks, securing U.S. borders, and managing immigration, a role also designated to the Department of Homeland Security. We see they're also tasked with protecting critical infrastructure, physical, like transportation hubs, and digital from cybersecurity attacks. We also have them responsible with responding to natural and man-made disasters through federal agencies like FEMA, and they coordinate intelligence efforts among various agencies to ensure a unified approach to national security threats. So, and again, this was created 11 days after 9/11 and shows a refocusing of our federal government in response to a national security threat. Now, we also see the Department of Homeland Security. If we rewind a good bit in U.S. history, we see that this was officially established by Congress in 1979, but as we previously addressed, that a lot of these agencies and collectives within these departments were already present prior. And we see that this was first created as the Office of Education within the Department of the Interior in 1867 during the Reconstruction era after the Civil War. This was also, so when we look at the Department of Education, simply put, some of the functions include promoting student achievement and preparation for global competitiveness. It's how we make sure that throughout the entire United States, we are competing on the international stage when it comes to our academia. We also ensure equal access to education for all. We need to make sure that resources are accessible to people in low-income communities. We also have to see that the Department of Education oversees federal education funding, how these funds are allocated. We can't have funds exclusively going to the regions in which we have the most wealth already present. We need to make sure these are equally distributed. We need to also see that the Department of Education enforces federal education laws and conducts research and provides data on education. A lot of this, they are constantly enacting studies, trying to explore better ways to educate mass populations and provide the most utility in any educational system. And yeah, we'll just stick with the basics on how it was originally created in 1867 during the Reconstruction era, and then officially established by Congress in 1979, and the general functions of this body. Now, the bureaucracy. We've all heard of the bureaucracy that drives some of us crazy, and of course employs some of us, because the bureaucracy consists of 2.1 million federal employees. These are individuals that were not elected. They were not appointed by a president. They were hired because of their ability to do a job. You could also include the post office, make it 2.5 million. I don't even know why some numbers include and don't include the post office. Now, it is once again very important to emphasize these are positions not directly appointed by the president. They should have no relationship to the current sitting president. These are civil service employees, government employees who obtain positions based on merit, their ability to do the job, the fact that they have past experience relating to the position they're aiming to fill. We have seen in recent weeks some very specific members of the bureaucracy have been under criticism, either in two scopes, either as we've seen this understanding of appointment powers being pushed a little bit as various individuals have been laid off that were members of the bureaucracy. And we also see that the Department of Government Efficiency is focusing on slimming down the bureaucracy and minimizing the amount we spend on employing individuals within these positions. The merit to that is up for debate, of course. I am not at all placing any of my positions in that statement. I just wanted you to understand the bureaucracy and also see when you turn on the news how you might be seeing these positions being referenced, what some of these roles are. So We also have to remember the vice president. A couple key details in this slide, although there are not many words. So we see the president, the vice president is the president of the Senate. That is one of the many specific powers designated to the vice president. What does it mean to be the president of the Senate? The president of the Senate is the individual who casts tie-breaking votes. We see this has already been utilized in this presidency during a cabinet appointment in which we saw J.D. Vance enacting a tie-breaking vote for one of the early appointments. We also see that this has been utilized numerous times in American history, and every vice president will cast at least a handful of tie-breaking votes, either on legislation, judicial appointments, cabinet appointments, or something of that nature. We see that the vice president is also aimed to be a strengthening to the presidential ticket. They run for office together. Remember, because of the 12th Amendment, we do have to vote for the president and vice president on different ballots. But the vice president is oftentimes, and in recent years, connected to the vice president. The vice president is connected to the president, and it runs alongside them early on to strengthen the ticket. We've seen when you look at them on a social level, they tend to represent a contrast to the candidate that is running on the primary ballot. J.D. Vance under Donald Trump, younger individual representing a different niche part of the Republican Party. We saw you look at Joe Biden to Barack Obama, you look at Dick Cheney to George Bush. We see a lot of contrast when it comes to vice president. We also see that this is oftentimes the roadmap, a stepping stone to getting to the presidency. As early American history, we remember George Washington's vice president became the second president. John Adams' vice president became the third president, Thomas Jefferson. And this progression has continued 8 times throughout American history and will likely be repeated again. The last position within the executive branch that we're focusing on today consists of the governor. And it's important to study this, and we won't spend too much time or really have to understand the role of the governor on a very specific level beyond understanding that they are the leader of the executive on the state level. They have a very similar role to the president, but exclusively relating to their state. Some of the powers designated to governors consists of approving new legislation or drafting executive orders, as executive orders do exist on the state level. And we also see that they have the power to veto legislation or sign it into law once it has been passed by the state House and state Senate, the state legislature. We also see that the executive, head of the executive on the state level, the governor, has the power to command the state National Guard. We also see that they have the ability to manage agencies on the state level, appoint state judges, as the head of the executive appoints federal judges exclusively. We also see that the governors grant clemency and reprieves for state crimes. And when we look at reprieves, pardons, and commutations enacted by the president, it is important to also remember that this exclusively relates to federal charges. If a charge happened on the state level, then it is the responsibility of the governor to grant clemencies, reprieves, and pardons. We also see that the governors interface with other states and the federal government to make sure the needs of their state are met in all federal national agreements. So the governor acts as the head of the executive on the state level. Now, how can the other 2 branches, remember we've talked about the system of checks and balances, the Federalist paper that specifically addressed the benefits of checks and balances within our federal government. We see that, well, there are a couple checks granted to the legislative and the judicial branch to limit the power of the executive branch. Because, like John Locke identified, we have to have measures in place if an individual in office becomes exorbitant with their use of their power. And some of these checks consist of the legislative branch being able to impeach the president. Remember, how many steps are there in that process? 2 steps. Vote for impeachment in the House, removal from office in the Senate. We also remember that the legislative branch can approve or disapprove of judicial or cabinet appointments provided by the president. They have to vote and approve of these individuals for them to obtain the seat that the president appoints them to. They also have the power of the purse. We saw through the way the courts checked some of these executive orders enacted by presidents of the past, that the legislative branch is the body within our government that has the sole authority of determining how we spend our federal budget, our national budget. It is not a power designated to the president, and they do not have the authority to influence our national budget. We also see that the legislature approves treaties signed by the president, and they have to do this with a 2/3 majority vote, requiring almost at all times bipartisan support. Remember bipartisanship, working with individuals from opposite ends of a political spectrum. When polarization is high, bipartisanship is low. Remember that from the past. And we also remember that the legislative branch has the power to override a presidential veto. I have not covered this yet, but I'm covering it right now. So if a president does veto legislation, that legislation in the next session can be voted on by the House and the Senate. And if they get 2/3 majority in both bodies, then it will override a presidential veto and go into law no matter what. So even if you have a resistant individual in office, our legislative branch can unify to create legislation that will go into law. And then when we talk about the judicial branch, when we reference the executive orders and how they were struck down by the courts, that was a direct example of the judicial branch using their check on the executive branch. The judicial branch has the power to determine the constitutionality of presidential actions. Judicial branch cites exclusively our Constitution and statutory law to determine if actions or decisions made by the executive are constitutional. And if they are not constitutional, they are addressed in the courts and they are immediately struck down in their validity. So we see that these are the ways that our two other branches, the legislative branch and the judicial branch, act as checks on the executive. Now, remember our what did we learn slides. We cover a lot of the main takeaways from this week's lecture. A lot of this is review from high school history, but we also want to make sure that we understand what we need to remember when we talk about the executive branch in the future. What are the primary positions? President, vice president, the cabinet, bureaucracy, governors on the state level. What are the 3 requirements to being president of the United States? Natural born citizens, reside in the United States for 14 years, 35 years or older. What happens if there's a tie within the Electoral College? The 12th Amendment says the House votes to break that tie. What are the primary powers of the President of the United States? Well, I'm not going to ramble on that long as they are expansive and we have 2 slides covering them. How many steps are there in the impeachment process? House votes on impeachment, Senate votes, removal of office. That second step has never been completed. I explained the history of the impeachment in the United States. We just did that. 4 impeachments successful, 3 presidents. What is the bureaucracy? How many individuals are there in the bureaucracy? Bureaucracy consists of 2.1, sometimes 2.5 if you count the post office, million individuals that are appointed based on merit and should not be in have any relation to the President of the United States. What historical event led to the creation of the Department of Homeland Security? Remember, George Bush created the Department of Homeland Security through an executive order in 2001, 11 days after the attacks of 9/11. We can see also how can the legislative and judicial branches maintain oversight over the executive. The powers of the legislative branch to check the executive are expansive, ranging from ways to draft legislation that does not even need presidential approval, acting as a check on appointments, and we also see they're empowered to impeachment and numerous others. And we also see the judicial branch has the power to check the constitutionality of executive actions. And we specifically looked at some examples of how the judicial branch checked the use of executive orders by numerous presidents in recent years. Here are those answers, written out and said better. And what is due this week? Make sure you do your discussion posts. Go through your readings. There are a lot of readings this week as we have an assignment, as we have to summarize a couple of these readings. Don't just do one. Make sure you read those instructions and complete the summary assignment accurately. I will be grading this with a little more scrutiny than I have in the past. If you go over the word limit, you will have a point deduction. I do not want to see how well you can write even if you're writing twice as much. I want you to meet the requirements. Simply write within that I forget the exact word limit. I think I shrunk it a little bit from the past to give you guys a little bit easier of a time. But make sure you are specific with how many words you use use your word counter, because I will be doing that, and I will take points off if you go over and points off if you go under. And I gave you a sweet spot, a little range, I believe, of about 25 words that you can meet, which makes this a lot easier. I've had many assignments in the past when I was in college that had to be to the exact word count. So this is a good practice in achieving that goal. And if you have any questions, reach out to me. I'm happy to help you out anytime. Let's work together. Let's get this done. Reach out with any questions. Thank you guys for another good lecture.